Want to introduce today's keynote speaker, speaking on what's new or not in 2020. Are we making progress on the intractable security problems? We have Larkin Ryder. She's the interim CISO at Slack. And here you go.
All right, let's move off the big picture of my face. Oh, okay. Oh, on to the next one. Yeah. You don't want to have to come out of this. Yeah. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start in the interest of time because the first few slides are mildly amusing, but really I can just stand here and talk and that'll be great. So I am excited to be here talking about the next big thing, but I'm going to talk about the last 10 years of big things instead in my presentation, so we're all grounded in our history, something I know I need to take more time to do. Speaking of my history, yes, I am currently the acting Chief Security Officer at Slack, and nobody's more surprised about that than I am. Right, so how did that happen? Well, I have to blame in part these two gentlemen right here. In 2004, my manager decided to flee back to France for an extended vacation at the end of the year while we were completing our Sarbanes-Oxley audit. And there was just one thing left to do, and that was to secure the databases with the financial statements in them, the financial records. No problem, right? That's the core of what you do for SOX. And of course, I had zero experience at that time, either in security or databases, so I was the perfect person to take on this task in a very small company. I didn't mess that up too badly, it turns out, so they let me take a crack at messing with the network as part of PCI DSS. Great, wonderful. You can feel free to take my slides wherever you want to, if you need to move them. And if I have to work without my speaker notes, it's whatever, I don't mind. I'll just make something up, it's fine, it's fine. It's what I was gonna do anyway. So that went okay, and that led me on to working in the enterprise security team at Twitter, and then working at Slack as the Director of Risk and Compliance, and then Director of Product Security, and apparently the natural progression from doing all that is to be the acting Chief Security Officer. Great. Okay, let's get back to where we were. All right, and then here we are at BSides, woohoo, celebrating our 10th anniversary. Exactly. This is actually, I'm so excited to be here because this is actually my favorite conference that I go to. Of all the security conferences that I have been to so far, I haven't found one I like more than BSides. It's local, I don't have to travel, it's the right size, and I get to see a bunch of people who I look forward to seeing every time. I can't walk down the hall without collecting like 10 hugs. All right, so what have we done in the last 10 years to bring us here? What have we accomplished? Well, to have that conversation, I want to have that conversation, but first I'm going to treat you all to a little story. So my husband and I, a little while ago, were looking at combining some investment accounts, right? So we had to get on the phone with the agent who had these separate accounts. They were all in one company, but separate accounts. We wanted to bring them together. The agent is like, okay, let me ask you some identity information. So the agent is collecting like your name, your birthday, your social security number, et cetera. And then, Ms. Ryder, I have one last security question for you. Can you please tell me what is the name of the street you grew up on? Oh, the name of the street, okay. Typey, look it up. All right. Capital D, %, open question mark, smiley face, and lowercase p, uppercase number 1, whatever. I had a long string and I read it off, and that was the answer to that question. And then, thank you, Ms. Ryder, that's correct. Mr. Ryder, can I ask you, please tell me the name of your first pet? And my husband, his eyes get a little wide, and then his shoulders just start shaking with laughter, and he says, "Rover," and that is what it's like in my house. All right. So talking about the events of the last 10 years that shaped our perception, I'm going to talk a little bit about some fun malware, some great data breaches, and some awesome vulnerabilities. Starting right away with malware. I remember when I thought about malware when I first started out in my security career, my perception was, that ruined somebody's day, that's too bad that happened to that other person over there on their one computer and nobody else was impacted, and that's annoying, but I didn't really think of it as anything that was particularly earth-shattering, world-changing, important. All right, well, let's jump into 2010, okay? Because that's when Stuxnet really became something that we were allowed to become aware of, and this is a really interesting story. So we're maybe talking about $20 million in centrifuges that were damaged by Stuxnet, but really the implications defy math here, right? This is, for those of you who don't know, the malware that was introduced to the uranium enrichment facility in Natanz. So this had the purpose of disrupting the Iranian ability to enrich uranium. It was a program that was started by the US government, and it's fascinating how it progressed. If you haven't read Kim Zetter's Countdown to Zero Day book, I really recommend it. It's an amazing read. I can't wait to see who's in the movie. All right, and then WannaCry, of course, landed many years later. This was one of the most dominant pieces of ransomware. $4 billion were impacted across 150 countries. And then NotPetya was really fun. Not really ransomware. This ostensibly was the Russian government trying to destabilize Ukraine. I think something like around 70% of the infections were in that one geographic location, right? So this, again, like Stuxnet, was very targeted. I think the introduction point was some document that was widely used for filing taxes in Ukraine or something. So, of course, with all malware, it wasn't just contained to the Ukraine. I bet some of these other US companies, global companies that were impacted, maybe they had to file taxes in the Ukraine and they were impacted as well. All right, so talking about data breaches. Here's a list of data breaches. It's a small list compared to the actual number of data breaches. This is a very US-centric list. It really focuses on some of the larger breaches. They would look larger if Yahoo didn't look so big. Sorry about that, Yahoo. That's just how things are when you have 3 billion as your winning number. But Yahoo is one of my favorite breaches as well, because there are great records that I've seen. I've seen great presentations about the Yahoo breach. And understanding that this is a case where we got from identification, all the way through prosecution to conviction for the people who are responsible, like, yay, I hope that's something that we can do more of if we work harder on our attribution capabilities. In this case, names, email addresses, telephone numbers, birth dates, passwords, and security questions were all impacted. So adult friend finder is possibly a different motivation. This one in Ashley Madison, maybe those are motivated by people who are making a moral judgment on the users of these sites. But again, you have some very private data that's being impacted here as well. In this case, plain text or weekly hash passwords were included. Okay, Target takes me all the way back to my BSidesSF roots, right? So looking at this particular compromise of these point-of-sale systems, it was one of those cases where the hackers had to go in and fix bugs in the point-of-sale systems that they were attempting to corrupt, because they had a plan, right? They had, a couple of weeks before Black Friday to get their malware in there, get it stable, get it working through the holiday season to get the payment card and debit card information that they wanted out of that environment. So they made sure that malware was good. They had to, of course, have access to the server that was cryptographically signing all the downloads to those point-of-sale systems. So, yay for network segmentation. And then they had to have an exfil path, and this is where famously a vendor was involved in the breach as well. We can talk about that in a bit. All right, so vulnerabilities earning names. There's so many here. You're not going to see your favorite. There are just too many favorite vulnerabilities, but Heartbleed was the one that really stuck in my consciousness as one of the first one. A memory leak in the Open SSL implementation for the TLS Heartbeat extension. This meant that anything that you were actually trying to encrypt on open networks was potentially available to someone who had access to that data stream. So very scary because, again, payment card data, passwords, private medical history information, anything could be exposed through this. Next up were Meltdown and Spectre. Very interesting because they were at the hardware architecture level, and of course, if you're working on in a processing environment where you have a shared hardware stack, then you're worried about processes being able to read the data of each other. And then Eternal Blue. Okay, Eternal Blue was actually the vulnerability that was behind WannaCry and not Petya. This was a mishandled SMB protocol packet that allowed malicious code execution. And this one was interesting because this was known for a long time by the NSA, and they chose not to disclose it so that they could capitalize on it. It was then eventually disclosed by shadow brokers. All right, so how have we been changed by these events? Well, I certainly just developed an increasing interest in information security as a result of being aware of all these things. But certainly we have to think about how that perception has changed, think about how those events have changed perception more globally. So this is a study that was done by the World Economic Forum, and it's a global risk perception survey. And you'll notice that number 5 and number 8 on this list are cyber attacks. So this is the list of things that they think will increase and be impactful in the next decade. I think part of that perception has to be defined by the media. So one thing I've noticed as I read the paper every day, and I do, and that's the sidewalk in front of my house where the paper actually in physical form gets delivered every day. And these are 3 articles that I found related to information security that were in the paper in one day. So I think that heightened awareness is something that we're all experiencing, but the media is bringing it into everybody's consciousness. But a lot of other things besides awareness changed in the last decade. Things materially changed in the way we get our job done. And I want to talk about some of the trends that I think are reshaping working lives. Certainly, we have to talk about the cloud. Certainly, we have to talk about privacy regulation and the ubiquity of mobile devices that I see literally right now pointing at me from around this audience. So talking first about cloud. So when I first started in computer science, my first job out of college was testing network equipment for Hewlett-Packard. So I quickly learned that I did not wear nice clothes for that job, because what you were going to be doing is there was this little mini data desks all around the perimeter, and then in the center of the building is the data center, where you go in there and you actually are installing these network devices, and you're pulling up the floor tiles and you're running the cables, because that's how networks were built. They were actually built in those days. That is not what we're doing right now, right? We have switched completely to virtualized environment, and software-defined networking is what we use every day. And of course, the most important device in that environment was the firewall that we were using to protect it. But now our perimeter is really identity secured. You have some combination of your human users and the passwords they use, and hopefully 2-factor, and probably their devices are a trust anchor, and their email are a trust anchor for making sure all that is working the way you want it to work as a security professional. And then finally, that perimeter, because now it's nice and virtualized, is evolving at an incredible rate. You can sign up for a new service faster than I can run that cable under that floor, for sure. Now, one of the things that really helps that, and I work at Slack, which is definitely part of this problem, I realized that as I put this slide up here with someone else's company, is that we have both free and paid tiers that are available to your users. So your users are having a great time going and finding whatever it is they need, and then clicking the accept button on those terms of service, and then uploading your company's private data there. Whether they're really authorized to agree to those terms of service on behalf of your company, that might be something that you want to remind them about. And of course, then you have all of that data ending up in the private cloud, right? In the cloud. So you're probably, as a security professional, thinking, oh, what can I do to make sure I'm tracking all the data that's ending up in the? You're probably thinking about more cloud services that you're going to buy to help you track that data that's ending up in the cloud, or maybe you actually have a controlled network environment and a CASB, and you want to go old school with that. But again, what you're doing is you're bringing more vendors into the equation, and this puts more. Vendor risk management, vendor security review was definitely something that I thought about in 2010, but now it's just like, I need more people for that. We need a better solution as a community for how we establish trust with all the vendors that we rely on. And that is important because every vendor that is on this screen here was material in a breach, a significant breach, probably one of the ones on the list. Fazio was the mechanical service that controlled the HVAC system that was the exfil vector for the target point of sale malware. All right, and of course, Spectre and Meltdown. So which we already talked about, right? But we're all hosting data on these shared services. So our hosting environment is also a cloud environment. It's also a virtualized environment. So basically every one of my customers was like, I need to talk to the CISO now when Spectre and Meltdown became a thing because they wanted to know that their private data in my AWS environment was being protected from Spectre and Meltdown. All right, so one of the good things that I think has happened, because you can't just spend all our time talking about the bad things that have happened, is privacy. The privacy regulation that has come forward in the last 10 years has been certainly significant. We have two things that are of importance. Mostly in the EU, we have GDPR, and then here in California, we have CCPA. So that's the General Data Protection Regulation and the California Consumer Privacy Act. Both of those give some protections on these areas, right? It makes sure that you as a user have permission, or are granting permission both for the processing and in some cases the selling of your data. You can have your data removed, the right to be forgotten as it's commonly known. You have visibility to the data that's being stored about you. You have a requirement for breach notices. You have some data portability, so you don't get locked in one particular vendor because they have so much of your data. You have the right to remove that information. And then there are monetary penalties, and my favorite one, the right to private action. That means, for example, under CCPA, that you as the consumer have a right, if you have non-encrypted, non-redacted personal information, and it is subject to unauthorized access, exfiltration, disclosure, as a result of the business failing to maintain security procedures and practices that are appropriate. So this is saying that we as cloud service providers, as holders of consumer data, have to make sure that we're doing right by the consumer with respect to security, or they have the right to come after us appropriately. The only thing I don't like about all the privacy regulation is that it does take resources away from everything else I'm trying to do for security, because I have to rush over to whatever that regulation is. I have to, walk through that checklist of security requirements and making sure that I'm doing all of them. And they are vague. They're not prescriptive. They're very broad. I have to actually talk to lawyers about how to interpret them and whether they really map to my system of controls or not, or do I have a gap and what is everyone else doing, and has there been litigation that's decided what good looks like about what you do with IP addresses, for example. I would love it if there were a more prescriptive standard that everyone could agree to, everyone could align on, and just go do ISO 27701 and everybody will be good, something like that. All right, okay, so now let's talk about bring your own device. The mobile devices are ubiquitous, and I love mobile devices. They are great. They're easy to use. The apps are just downright almost fun, even if they're work-based. It's easy, token-based access for getting whatever you want. There are notifications coming to my device all the time. Everybody loves me, isn't that great? But from my perspective, easy 2FA, right? This is a way for me to put a second factor of authentication in front of my entire, identity protected perimeter that will actually be usable for my users. So I'm happy about that. And there are biometrics there, which I have mixed feelings about. Biometrics are potentially complex from a privacy point of view, but for users who need it, if they need a biometric to authorize themselves and keep that second factor easy enough to use, I'll take it. But there's the problem of loss, right? We've had this problem for a while, but it's really more so with the there's an expectation of mobility among our employees, right? So they have their mobile devices, and they expect to be able to use them for the work that they do. They're putting data on those devices, they're putting the tokens on those devices that are there potentially at risk. This has increased the use of laptops, in my opinion. I think the two go hand in hand. People just expect to be moving around more. And that can create problems for the company. Now, one is, of course, loss. It's extremely embarrassing when, laptops and devices get lost, and that exposes the information there, certainly for the company. I did a meaningless study where I collected 5 years of data to see, what happens to laptops and, what's the behavior there? Yeah, cars and bars, pretty much if you're losing a laptop or a personal device, it's either gonna be because you left it in your car or you took it to a bar. And, I know everybody does those things, just letting you know. And then there's the complexity of the fact that you're putting your company's data on your personal device, whether you're using a personal laptop or a personal phone. How many people here right now today are carrying 2 phones for this very reason? Okay, yeah, that's about what I thought, right? I mean, they're like maybe 5 to 10% of the people here are doing that because they've been through this before. And the rest of you haven't been through this yet, so you're not doing it, but once you have, you will. Because if your company ever needs to take your device from you and get a complete image of it for discovery purposes, you are not gonna feel very comfortable about having that ever happen to you a second time. And then malware is increasingly becoming something that we have to worry about in the mobile device ecosystem. Hummingbird was installed on 10 million devices. This is, I won't go into detail here, but that is a Android system malware, I think going back to 2016. And there are as many as 24,000 malicious apps that are being blocked every day. So how many are actually being installed? Like it's an incredible volume and something that I think we don't have a great handle on. All right, I am going to give you another story here. Hang on, I gotta remember it because I'm not actually working from speaker notes up here in case you couldn't tell. This was the one where, which one was this, Arkady? Do you remember? Damn it, oh yeah, I remember. So my husband called his credit union. He needed to close out his account. So the agent picks up the phone, yes. My husband's like, yeah, I wanna close my account. Oh, yes, there is a charge for that. It's $1.95 to close your account. And I'll need a credit card from you. And my husband's, what? You're gonna charge me to close my account? That's ridiculous. And sir, if you want your account closed, you have to pay the $1.95 fee, but I'm ready to take your credit card number at any time. My husband's like, no, I'm not gonna pay you for that. And the agent hangs up on him. At which point my husband notices that he has misdialed the number for his credit union, and whoever he was talking to was actually not an agent of that company, just some guy who was collecting credit card numbers and, I don't know, probably more than $1.95 at a time. All right. So I don't make predictions about things, but if I were to make predictions, I'd probably make these 3, that we're going to see a lot more Internet of Things participation in virus distribution and botnets. I've heard, when I was getting ready for this presentation and looking around about things, one of the things that kept coming up was machine learning, because machine learning is all the rage. I can't wait to see the battle between the machine learning systems that are going to introduce the malware and the machine learning systems that are going to remove the malware. I know who I'm rooting for, but we'll see. And then the vulnerability of SCADA infrastructure. I think there was a recent Senate bill that was passed that was going to suggest that maybe more of our critical control systems should be analog and not digital. All right, so these are the things that have been changing, but how have these changes in the last 10 years impacted the struggles that we have with information security? Well, I think we talked a little bit about how the cloud is changing things, but I think there's some things that continue. And I want to focus now on kind of the constants, the work that continues. And I think user behavior continues to matter deeply. And I want to talk a little bit about detection. I kind of have a bee in my bonnet on detection right now. I always have one on user behavior. All right, so this is what I call the checklist of the impossible. This is the list of things that people tell users that they always have to do. And I call this the checklist of the impossible because while it is still important for security, it is also anathema to most of the work that our users are doing, right? They're in the cloud all the time. The cloud runs on links. Those links are going to show up and, attachments as downloads from those services. All of these are things that I know most of the people I work with, they have to interact with every single day. So telling them, oh, you know how you do your work, don't do it that way, seems like an impossible ask to me. Staying patched is something, I'd like us to solve those problems. I'd like us to figure out how we can make sure things just update seamlessly and automatically and without too much user interruption, maybe minimize what level is needed if that's possible. I realize that there's still 1 million machines vulnerable to eternal blue, so this must be a hard problem for people, right? They must really need our support to figure out how to solve it. All right, and I know phishing is still the top threat action, so I know people are still clicking on links and entering their credentials, but again, we have to figure out how to make sure that that's something they can do safely. This is the second half of that checklist, and this is slightly less impossible, right? So we can probably avoid USBs, USB drives, probably VPN is fairly available for us. It's, I don't know, I don't back up my data, it's all just in the cloud, right? It's important to note that the USB, that was the entry point for Stuxnet, right? So for those of you who don't know, if you're trying to get software into a secret facility in Iran, you don't have a lot of network entry points. So it is still an interesting and valid vector for attack. But whatever you're trying to do, you probably have a cloud service that will let you do these things. You don't have to use USBs to move big files around anymore. But if I could simplify it for the user, if I could make it easier for them, if I could say, look, these are the only things that you have to, if I had to give a new user onboarding in 5 minutes, this would be the checklist that I would use. If you see something, say something. Probably the only time I was ever directly involved in a company that was experiencing an active attacker that was on their network and attempting to exfiltrate data came to light because one database engineer noticed one query on one server that was running too long. Unoptimized queries, on our database tier, that shouldn't be happening. Hey, Joe, look, there's this unoptimized query. Bill, that's odd. Let's go tell security. And that is how that attack came to light for the security team. That day could have gone so much differently for that company. I think this is one of the most important things we can tell our users. All right, use what I gave you. Please don't go up and sign up for the free tier. Customer data is off limits. That's kind of obvious. And if you don't understand why I'm adding friction for you, tell me that you don't understand, because I would love to explain it to you. I really would. My experience is 99.99% of the people that you work with, they just want to do the right thing. And they don't understand why they have to choose between right thing A and right thing B. And you're there to help them rationalize that. All right, and this is the final thing that I am concerned about. Detection. How much more time do I have left, by the way? I have 20 minutes. Oh, awesome. Okay, I can really grind this axe, is what I'm hearing here. So let me go back actually to this slide. So I was in a room recently with a team of other CISOs, and we were talking about metrics. And we were talking about how hard it is to define metrics for our industry. How do we meaningfully explain the great job we're doing as CISOs in building a security program and protecting the sensitive data that is in our care? And it's hard to find a metric that represents your progress towards preventing something from happening, which is what you're really trying to do as a CISO. And one of the things that we know is important is our ability to detect when the bad thing happens. And so we were talking about red team and attacks and the time to detect and how quickly we can do that. And is that a valid simulation or are we kidding ourselves? And kind of the consensus in the room settled down to, yeah, we're going to get owned, and we're not going to know it, and then we're going to get fired, and then all the CISOs are going to stand up and shift right one company and sit down again. And we're like, yeah, that's probably what's going to happen. But man, F that, right? Like, why aren't we going to know? Why can't we tell? We get so much data. We know that the most attacked industry is going to be healthcare, it's going to be organized crime, it's going to be a financial motivation. We have a lot of information that we should be relying on about what the threats are to the environment that we're working on, and we should use that data to understand who is coming after us and how they are coming after us. So here's what it's worth, right? We even know how much we need to spend, because we can take this data on what it's worth to the attacker, and we can figure out how many people they're going to need, what equipment they're going to buy, how much they're going to pay for those 0 days, so that they can get something of value to them. So we know exactly how much they're spending on what they're going to buy. We know a little bit about what they're going to buy is going to look like and what it's going to cost them. We can use that data to figure out what we should be spending in defense based on the information that we have. I know healthcare isn't spending that money, because you can see how challenged they are just to provide the services that they're trying to provide in this country in order to really do right by their patients. But last time I went to a new healthcare provider, they had to take a copy of my driver's license. Well, they had to look at my driver's license, and I think they took a copy of it when they copied my insurance card, because that insurance card is just a flimsy piece of paper that anyone could make a copy of, and they could say, hey, I'm Larkin Ryder, I need a new kidney, by the way. And it's trivially easy unless they can secure my identity with another piece of collateral. So I understand why they took it, and what I'm hoping is they took that piece of paper and they put it in a file and they locked it in a drawer, and they didn't upload it to a system. But I don't know for sure, right? So, we see how much the healthcare industry gets ransomed, and that worries me because I was talking with a friend, and he was saying, yeah, my concern is that the ransomware that we hear about at hospitals is just the visible example of how the healthcare industry is under attack. But they're really so owned in every other way that they're working, and they have zero detection, so they just don't know it. Because detection, to be clear, I know it's a hard problem. I know it is not easy to figure out your detection story. But if I land no other message in this presentation, and this is why I put this one at the end, is that we are the people who have to be responsible for changing that mindset and that attitude. We have to change that attitude in ourselves and with the people that we work for. How will you know if you're owned? What are the indicators that you have? And maybe you're like, Larkin, I got nothing, I'm starting from zero. Maybe I'm the first engineer at this company that's thinking about security, and I haven't got $1 to my budget's name or a clue of how I'm going to move forward. Well, I would say start somewhere, right? Just pick one thing. You've got to start somewhere, pick one thing that you think is important, and understand that one thing in detail. Get those logs, get new logs if you need them, study what normal looks like, and then build rules on what abnormal looks like when it occurs. Red team, rinse, repeat. So I worked for a while for Bob Lord at Twitter, and I read a blog post he wrote one time that was really interesting. It was based on the idea that if you need to build a new security team and you don't have a budget for it, one of the things you could do is just find enough money to hire some red team. Bring in that red team. Don't do anything to secure the systems. Don't put any preventive measures in place. Just go in with the red team and test them and test them and test them. And just keep showing people how you're owning them over and over and over again until the people who actually own the systems and care about the data and understand what the risk of the disclosure is there, they'll either hire their own security team or give you one. I think that's an interesting perspective. I think there are good things and bad things about that approach and things that do and don't work in the business that I'm currently in, but it's interesting, and frankly, I've always wanted to try it. So if any of you are in that position and you're the first security engineer and you're wondering how you're going to get through securing all of this infrastructure you have, let me know if you're interested in try that. I'd be interested to know how that works out for you. All right, so in closing, how do we keep on when we have so much on our plate, when we have so many things? I put this presentation together and I'm like, oh man, this is depressing. Like, there is too much here to think about. How do we keep from going crazy with this, infinite bag of risk that we all feel like we have to manage? Well, I have some ideas for you. Three really simple things. First of all, please recognize your burden. I know I have to spend a lot of time not thinking about that burden as the person who's ultimately responsible at Slack. But every now and then, please stop and recognize what you're doing and how it's important and how you feel about that, and make sure that you're not thinking about it too hard. And then bound your efforts. This is a strategy that I've had to use and I've had to ask my team to use. You have an infinite backlog of risk that you're trying to manage. Don't try to boil that ocean. Don't try to deal with it all at once. Prioritize ruthlessly and work on the first thing and let everything else wait to the next sprint. You can't do it all at once. You'll go crazy. And then finally, lean on your community. This is why we're here. So we have our community with us. So we get to spend a couple hours on 1 week talking to the people who really understand what we're doing, what we're struggling with, and how hard it can be. And maybe even get some tips for making it a little bit better. Thank you so much. All right, do I get to answer some questions now?
There were no questions on Slido.
Oh, all right.
One brilliant joke, which is, shouldn't CISO musical chairs shift left, not shift right. So thank you for that. Larkin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
A small gift from
Thank you.
B-Sides.
Appreciate
It's
it.
a brilliant presentation.
I appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone. See you out there.